Welcome to The Analysis. I'm Greg Wilpert. Today we'll revisit the situation in Bolivia, where conditions remain tense about 8 months since the leftist Luis Arce became president. Prosecutors are going after the previous coup government of Janine Áñez, who had ousted left-wing President Evo Morales in November 2019 and unleashed a wave of violence against Morales' supporters, killing dozens and injuring and arresting hundreds. Last March, police arrested former coup President Janine Áñez herself, together with many of her ministers and leaders of the national police and the military, who are being accused of human rights abuses during her government. Meanwhile, last week, the online publication The Intercept revealed details of a second coup plot that was supposed to have prevented Luis Arce from assuming presidency last November. In the end, nothing came of that plot, and Arce took office uneventfully. Joining me now to discuss these and other recent developments in Bolivia is Ali Vargas. He's a journalist with theAnalysis-news and is currently based in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Thanks for being here, Ali.
Thanks for having me on, Greg, and it's great to be able to discuss these issues. And I'm glad Bolivia hasn't fallen out of public conversation, because what's going on now, the process of getting justice for the coup, for getting justice for the abuses, for the torture, for the massacres of last year, is an incredibly important process for the whole region. You know, I think this can send a message throughout Latin America about the fact that if coups such as these pop up again, as they have done, and as they are threatening to, currently, then there will be consequences. There will be justice brought down on those responsible. So the process of uncovering what really happened, enacting justice, I think, is a historical moment for the region.
Now, I wanted to exactly ask you a little bit more detail about that. I mean, the Organization of American States, Human Rights Watch, and the Washington Post have all actually condemned the Luis Arce government's actions, or particularly the prosecutors, saying that they're basically overstepping their boundaries and that they don't have a case, essentially. So just tell us, what are they being, what are the Janine Áñez and her government officials, what are they being accused of, and what do you think this means for Bolivia at the moment?
Yeah, I think it was disappointing to see the way in which, but perhaps not surprising, to see the way that organizations such as Human Rights Watch, these sort of US-based NGOs, the US government itself, through its Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, condemning the Bolivian government for, particularly for the arrest of Janine Áñez, who was the president last year, the de facto president last year. It's disappointing because what are they suggesting, that there should be impunity for what happened last year? Bolivia last year went through an incredibly serious political crisis, which wasn't a case of sort of a conflict between two sides. What took place was that one side, if you will, seized power through non-democratic means, not at the ballot box, and a right-wing minority governed the country for almost a year without having ever won a vote. And now, within 10 days of taking power in November 2019, they launched 2 massacres. They killed numerous other protesters in different parts of the country. You know, at these massacres, there were military helicopters flying at 40 to 50 meters over the ground, shooting indiscriminately at the population. There are hundreds of people with serious life-changing injuries. So many died, long after the repressions took place from the injuries that they sustained that day. And after those massacres, there was a concerted campaign, a very organized campaign of political persecution against anyone and everyone who identified with Evo Morales' party, the Movement Towards Socialism, the party that, since 2005 has won every single general election. So that this was a campaign of political persecution against the majority of Bolivians. Any union leaders, indigenous leaders were either forced into exile, forced into hiding. In the case of the union leader in the Department of Santa Cruz for the Central Obrera Boliviana, which is the main sort of labor union confederation, he disappeared for a year. He had to go into hiding. People were threatening to burn down his home. People were looting his union officers. So right-wing gangs affiliated with the Áñez government were looting the union officers. He was forced into hiding. Others, lived the entire year with charges hanging over them. Here in Cochabamba, one of the most prominent union leaders, Coca-Cola union leaders, Andrónico Rodriguez, by the time the Áñez government fell, he had almost 20 different sort of invented charges hanging over him, including for things such as terrorism and sedition, for example, calling Henning Áñez a coup president. That was considered terrorism and sedition. These are the sorts of charges that were sprayed at thousands of people last year. Over 500 people were detained on political charges over last year. So how can you say that there cannot be a process of justice, that the crimes are not committed? And I think the charges that are being presented against Henning Áñez at the moment are very straightforward charges that are presented in, for example, in the United States. So they center on sort of three main things. The main one is her participation in the coup d'etat in November 2019. There was not, when Evo Morales was forced to resign by the military, there was not a constitutional succession that took place, and therefore conspiring to break the constitutional order is a crime in every single country with a government, with a functioning state. And in fact, at the moment, there are hundreds of people being charged with these sorts of crimes in the United States for their assault on the Capitol building. Another of the charges are for the rampant corruption there was last year. At the height of the pandemic, there was a very serious case of sort of embezzlement of funds destined for the purchase of COVID-19 ventilators to the tune of millions. So all of these things are, they're not political charges. There are things that are considered crimes in every single country all around the world. And to say that there should be impunity for these acts, I think, sets a very dangerous precedent for the region, because then future Henning Áñez wannabes, which I think we're seeing right now in Peru, in fact, will think that they can do this with impunity as well. If we can bring justice against all of the people who broke the constitutional order in Bolivia, I think the whole region will be in a much more democratic environment.
November, a number of Áñez sympathizers and former government officials, apparently led by Áñez's defense minister, Luis Fernando López, discussed a plan for members of the military, the police, and mercenaries that are based in the U.S. to try to overthrow the government before Arce could take office, in order to prevent him from taking office, obviously. The internet apparently has the phone recordings and emails that substantiate this plan, but the plan was never actually executed. Now, how has this revelation, has it been recounted? I mean, has it been made public in Bolivia? And if so, what does it say about the stability or instability of the Arce government, assuming that most of this is probably true?
Yeah, that's right. If we remember, after a year of Henning Áñez in power and all of the persecution I outlined just now, despite all of the repression, all the attempts to wipe out the movement towards socialism as a political force, the first opportunity that Bolivians had to express themselves politically at the ballot box in October 2020, the movement towards socialism won with a landslide. They won with 55% up against around 28% for the second place pro-coup candidate Carlos Mesa. So it was an overwhelming mandate to govern. So there was a small gap, of course, as in most countries, between the moment of the day of an election and the day of where the new government takes power. And there was a period of about a couple of months in Bolivia. And in that time, the defense minister, Fernando Lopez, who, you know, is one of the people responsible for the massacres that took place in 2019, he suggested enacting essentially a self-coup. That is to say, launching a second coup against his own government, or rather with his own government, to establish essentially a junta and to stop Luis Arce from taking power. And part of this plan was to hire hundreds of mercenaries from the United States to come in and work with a tiny number of elite military units to sort of take control of key state institutions. And then on the streets, they would have sort of paramilitary fascist gangs that were activated in 2019 to sort of, you know, fight the battle on the streets. And these groups such as the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala, Unión Juvenil Cruceñista, who in 2019 were the foot soldiers of the anti-Evo Morales protests, people who unleashed extraordinary violence, particularly against indigenous people. So that was the plan. And according to the conversations that were had, there were a number of government ministers who wanted to, you know, to launch this, to enact this. However, the military itself was skeptical that this was, you know, that this was a credible plan, and eventually, it came to nothing. Fernando Lopez himself escapes Bolivia to Brazil the day that Luis Arce takes power in November, where he is currently living today, under the protection of the Bolsonaro government in Brazil. So yeah, I think this definitely sent shockwaves through Bolivia. This, you know, gave another. It was another reason for people to see that what took place in Bolivia was a coup. That these are people who did not take power through democratic means, and they were trying to hold on to it through non-democratic means. And this, as soon as people heard it, as soon as people heard the details of what that planned, people immediately knew that it was true. This is absolutely in character for figures such as Fernando Lopez, Arturo Murillo, Janine Áñez, and the way that they governed the whole last year, right? They governed as a tiny minority party that had never even reached the heights of becoming the second largest opposition party, but somehow they had to govern the country for a year almost without any political allies. And by the end, Janine Áñez left power with about 7 or 8% approval ratings. Today, everyone who supported the coup and was with her at the beginning pretends that they weren't. It was, they had very little social base on the streets. Certainly none that was mobilizing by the end. So they were in a very precarious position, and the only way they could govern was as a tiny minority terrorizing the majority. And this is, I think, what the plan reveals.
Now, President Luis Arce, as we mentioned, represents the movement towards socialism, the MAS, and he used to be finance minister under Evo Morales. And he recently actually was able to celebrate a success of sorts. I mean, despite all of these problems that we're talking about, he was able to celebrate a success with the March 7 regional elections. Talk about this result of the regional elections, what it means for Arce and for the political situation in Bolivia at the moment.
Well, I think the March 7 local elections, in Bolivia you always have the local elections for the governorships and municipal mayors about 2 or 3 months after the general elections. I think it's a funny system, to have it so soon after. I think you should either have it at the same time or perhaps as a midterm sort of thing, because when you have it a few months after, you get all kinds of strange political distortions, and I think that's what we saw. It was a mixed bag in reality for the movement towards socialism. In a lot of places, they won big, won outright. In Potosí, in Oruro, in Cochabamba with a crushing majority. But there are a number of local factors that affected the result, and I think international analysts would look at that and be like, and try and draw wider lessons. For example, in the city of El Alto is, I would say, the Latin America's primary rebel city, revolutionary city. It has been the place from which successive neoliberal governments in Bolivia have been overthrown, and of course a bastion of the movement towards socialism. In 2020 they won with over 70% of the vote there, but because of a very sort of local dispute that was had between in the couple of months prior, their sort of most high profile figure called Eva Copa had a sort of a personal falling out with other sections of the party, so she ran on her own platform and was able to win. And I think, as someone, my own family lives in El Alto, I know that, there's always these kinds of sort of local disputes and conflicts. But it was quite annoying to see various international media outlets sort of writing articles about how the city of El Alto has turned its back on the movement towards socialism. There's a split within the ranks of the party. This is not something that fits with reality. This is in fact something that happens almost every local elections. It happened at the last local elections, and that's because various places in Bolivia have various local factors. So I wouldn't read too much into the local elections that took place in Bolivia. I think Bolivians as a whole are really rebellious. Bolivians are rebels, and that's partly why Áñez was unable to govern. And the movement towards socialism has been able to always sort of maintain that energy behind it. That doesn't mean that within itself it has all kinds of conflicts, it has all kinds of internal disputes, people demanding their certain positions within the state apparatus. And because it tells you a lot about the character of the movement towards socialism in government, of the Bolivian state. Because the movement towards socialism is not simply some progressive party or left-wing party that takes power and enacts a number of progressive policies. The movement towards socialism is a coalition of social movements. And that makes it incredibly powerful as a movement. It also means that once you take power, the movement towards socialism creates an environment where different movements, groups, workers' groups, indigenous groups can participate. And that is, of course, very democratic. It opens up the institutions of the states as social movements. But the contradiction in there is that, some people want this, other people want that, and there can be a clash within that forces of which movements will have a responsibility for what things, for example. Or, there's always a fight over who's going to be the Minister of Agricultural Development, for example. The movement towards socialism is overwhelmingly supported by indigenous rural voters and social movements. But there's social movements in the Amazon, there's social movements in the Andes, in the valleys. Where's the Minister of Agriculture going to come from? Is he, which social movement is he going to come from? And everyone wants to put their own person. It's one of the problems, you could say, but I think one of the growing pains of building a sort of participatory state.
Now, as you mentioned, as the one with a very solid majority, 55% of the vote, and he basically, of course, promised to undo the Coup government's right-wing policies, which were quite numerous, given that it was only in office for a year, and then also to, of course, continue Evo Morales' legacy. but what concretely has he been able to do in the 8 months or so that he has been in office so far?
Luis Arce was the economy minister under Evo Morales, and I mean he's an economist. He is, studied economics both in Bolivia and in the UK. He studied, his master's is from Warwick University. He's a very advanced economist, and he was, you know, the brains behind the socio-economic model built under Evo Morales' government, which is based around the nationalization of natural resources, and sort of having the state as an entrepreneur, as a force within the economy, generating revenues that can be brought into the state and then spent on things like infrastructure, social programs, etc. That model was completely destroyed last year within, you know, a couple of months, really, because what happened after the coup was that the huge network of state industries that exist in Bolivia, that form the largest, you know, the most important sections of the economy, were all closed down, all with the exception of the gas industry. Just near here where I'm sitting, there's a vast giant plant producing fertilizer, for example, not only for the national market but for export. That was built by Evo Morales' government. In fact, it was launched in the last year before the coup. The coup government, and yes, simply closed it down, closed the factory gates, fired all the workers. And of course the logic is that you know, the economy should be driven by the free market, shouldn't have the state as the leading force within it. Therefore you have to shrink the size of the state, and allow the invisible hand of the market, or however people characterize it, to work its magic. The reality of what happened was that, you know, with the closure of all these state industries and development projects, was just mass unemployment. Unemployment more than tripled within the first few months. The poverty was just evident, you know, across the streets. It was a really dire economic situation, and all of this was before the pandemic. So by the end of Áñez's rule, she would say, well, of course there was an economic crisis. You know, we were faced with an unprecedented COVID crisis, which of course is true, and the pandemic destroyed economies everywhere in the world. But this economic crisis started before, with the paralyzation of all this. Another example is the lithium industry. Bolivia had just started in the salt flats of Uyuni. Evo Morales had built 2 processing plants for potassium chloride. And we're starting to be able to build batteries and things like this. Again, just in one day to the next, just completely closed down. The factory gets closed. It seems like madness, you know. It seems like it's deliberate economic vandalism, and that's what it was essentially. Was the state retreating from its role within the economy. So now, the absolute number one task of Luis Arce's government is rebuilding the economy. Returning Bolivia to the economic growth it had under Evo Morales. And in that, I think there's been some really interesting things going on. Already Bolivia in the first quarter had a growth of 5.5% in GDP. The first, you know, sign of growth in over a year. So that's incredibly positive. Unemployment is down by 4%, from 11% to 7%. And that's something, that figure is continuing to fall. And part of it is driven precisely because Luis Arce is reactivating all of the projects that Henry Áñez closed. These are projects that he himself built with Evo Morales, and that he is now launching again. So the factory I talked about producing fertilizer, they're already starting to open that. That should be in the next couple of months. That should be at full capacity once again. All sorts. There's the lithium, of course, is set to be reopened. Number of infrastructure projects, the building the dual carriageway, the highway between Cochabamba and Santa Cruz, completely paralyzed last year. Now it's back on. You know, all of these big capitals of infrastructure projects that were frozen by, due to neoliberal reforms are now being turned on again. So the effect of doing that is to reignite the economy in a really important way. This, of course, is going to be a slow process. You know, building the highways that were, trashed last year is going to take a year, 2 years, 3 years perhaps, but it's something that has started at least, and this people are starting to note the differences. The economy is starting to reopen again.
One last question. When Luis Arce was running for president, everybody was claiming that he would be just Evo Morales' puppet. And of course, and Luis Arce, of course, tried to maintain his independence when he was running. But clearly, Evo Morales is back in Bolivia. Apparently, he played a bit of a role in the regional elections. But what is his role, more largely speaking, in Bolivia at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important issue because Evo Morales, I think, not just for Bolivians, but for social movements, indigenous movements around, across Latin America, is more than just a transitory president that can come in and come out. He represents a turning point in Bolivian history and a leadership that was lacking before he burst onto the political scene. A deep leadership, a very deep level. And yeah, I remember during the election campaign, there was, on the one hand, people saying Az is just a puppet of Evo Morales, and there was other, maybe wishful thinking from some sort of, mainstream media, foreign correspondents saying, well, hopefully Arce will be like a Lenin Moreno in Ecuador, will turn his back. He's not like Evo Morales. Luis Arce is a middle-class person from the city, from La Paz, with graduate studies. And maybe he's now going to be a moderate, he's going to be a sort of a Lenin Moreno type figure and undo the radicalism of Evo Morales' period. That has not happened. Luis Arce is from a middle-class background. Luis Arce never, didn't rise up through the ranks of the social movements like Evo Morales did, but he's very committed ideologically to the project. He was the architect of the economic side of the project of the last 14 years under Evo Morales. So he's deeply committed, and he's just yesterday in Venezuela, embracing Nicolas Maduro, saluting the Cuban Revolution. And today the headlines in the Bolivian papers were like, Luis Arce is cozying up to the Castro Chavista, etc., etc. So we can see that there was that the betrayal that people thought was going to happen has not materialized. And yeah, I think the role of Evo in this is incredibly important. I think a lot of ex-presidents dedicate themselves to becoming businessmen, enriching themselves. Evo Morales' role now is as political leader of the movement towards socialism. He is the president of the movement towards socialism as a party. He's the president of the 6 federations of the Tropico of Cochabamba, which is the coca growers union that he led. He's, back as president of that, that's the most important social movement in the country. So the country has the most control over the party. And Evo Morales is building a number of international projects. He launched the organization RUNASUR, it's due to be launched, and that is an alliance of social movements in South America, primarily indigenous social movements. And he has become essentially an international leader, but not at a state level, not as a politician, but as a leader of people, as a leader of movements, of workers, of campesinos. So I think that's the role he's going to take, of having a sort of moral leadership, a political leadership, without the trappings of the sort of state bureaucracy that he maybe had before. But of course his relationship with the state is very fluid, of course. He has meetings with Luis Arce very regularly, but his role is primarily at the basis, at the rank and file of the social movements.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there for now. I was speaking to Ali Vargas, journalist with Quechua News, based in Cochabamba, Bolivia. We'll provide a link also to your website so people can find it in the description. Thanks again, Ali, for having joined me today.
No, thank you, Greg.
And thanks to our viewers and listeners for joining the analysis. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to donate something at the website, theanalysis.news, so we can continue providing programming such as this.